The reading this morning is from Lamentations 3:19-26. Here Jeremiah speaks to us of how good God is to those whose hope remains in him. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord.
One of the things that, as human beings, we have to deal with is a very unstable world. It seems like there is no end to the difficulties, to the problems, to the issues, to the troubles, to the frustrations, to the griefs. We have been listening for the last 2 weeks about the story of the missing airplane and the extreme effect that has had on the loved ones. We've heard about the situation in Crimea. We've talked about the concern in the Ukraine. We think of the possibility of another sovereignty election or vote in Quebec. That there just seems to be no end to the issues and to the problems, to the stress that we face. And I think it's always helpful for us to turn to the Bible and to realize, number one, that things haven't really changed in all of the centuries since it was written. And to listen to people like Jeremiah, and this is who we want to think about, and we want to talk about this passage this morning. One of the things that's interesting about Jeremiah, and I find reading Jeremiah really interesting because there's just such a wealth in his in the book that bears his name. I see the frustration that he experiences, and I was looking at some comments that were made about Jeremiah, and they were just kind of looking at the psychology of Jeremiah. It's kind of interesting because he really reveals himself and his anguish and his pain and his frustration about everything that's happening around him and even what's happening with himself. This is why Jeremiah is known as and referred to as the weeping prophet. Because he is extremely emotional and troubled by what he experiences. And you may never have heard the word, but the word Jeremiah comes from Jeremiah. And it actually refers to a prolonged lamentation or complaint, which tells you a little bit about Jeremiah and about the book that bears his name and about the other book that, while it doesn't bear his name, many suppose that he wrote. And at this time, the northern kingdom is fallen at the time of Jeremiah. That Judah is there, but Judah is heading off the same track that the northern kingdom had gone, and there were some issues that were coming. And so Jeremiah had to foretell the fall of the southern kingdom of Judah and the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity, and that it would be for 70 years. He didn't have what you might call a really happy message. That he had to warn Judah and the people of Jerusalem for what is about to happen. And so, it would be one of those things that, we sometimes laugh a little bit at the story of Jonah, who's sent to Nineveh. And because Nineveh is, in his perception, a pagan city, that he's more than happy, after warning them about God saying that he's going to destroy this city because of its wickedness, that he wants to sit and get a ringside seat and watch all of this happen. It's kind of like he delights in the idea and gets really frustrated when God spares Nineveh because it repents. Jeremiah is kind of the opposite. He deeply feels his message. And he would have absolutely no satisfaction in seeing what he foretold taking place. And so with the fall of Jerusalem, the leaders and the prime people are taken into Babylonian captivity. There's a group that heads down into Egypt. It's just, everything just disintegrates. So just imagine that you're living in a culture or society where all of this is happening. It's just really one bad thing after another. You can understand why Jeremiah is depressed, why he's weeping. He's unhappy. And so he writes, where we believe he wrote the book of Lamentations, and you notice that word there at the beginning, lament. It is it's an expression of his grief over what has happened in the city of Jerusalem and in the area around it. And just to kind of think about it from the perspective of Lamentations, that God's royal city, this is where he had set up the monarchy. This is where basically he'd put his presence into the temple, but it's been destroyed. That the book of Lamentations looks at the idea that all, from prince to pauper, from king to priest, all have suffered in the fall. That this has become an unspeakable tragedy, and by unspeakable, it's just even Jeremiah mentions that there's cannibalism going on. It's just, how do you watch something like that happen? And so he says in chapter 1, her foes have become her masters. All the splendor has departed. And they were proud of Jerusalem. They were proud of their kingdom. And it's just all in rubble and ashes. So how do you react to something like that? What do you do? Well, you think about how people respond to loss like that. Grief. I mean, we think about, and we talk about sometimes about the stages of grief that people process through, and they're facing a very deep loss. And often we think about that in terms of a death, either facing a terminal illness of their own or death of somebody close. But, we kind of understand, well, it's more than that, because, you watch the news and somebody loses their house. And they go through those stages of grief. Somebody loses a job. Go through the stages of grief. There are different levels, different degrees of severity maybe, but we grieve when things are hard and difficult, and when there's loss and change. Sometimes people respond to anger, which is another one of those stages. Sometimes people resort to platitudes. Unfortunately, those are only empty words. So sometimes it's people who try to be helpful. It's not a helpful thing to do. And sometimes people need to really think about the implications of what they're saying. Sometimes people rely on false or vain hopes. There's a passage in the Psalms that I thought was really interesting in this regard. The psalmist wrote, "A horse is a vain hope for deliverance, despite all of its great strength, it cannot save." That people sometimes look to the wrong places for help and for hope. and it can't offer that. Now, the psalmist went on to say this in the following verses. But the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, on those whose hope is in his unfailing love. We wait in hope for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. In him our hearts rejoice, for we trust in his holy name. May your unfailing love rest upon us, O Lord, even as we put our hope in you. See, the psalmist realized, and what Jeremiah realizes, that hope, to have any meaning, to be real, needs to be in something other than what is immediate, what is right here, what is right now, what is impermanent, what is ultimately powerless. Jesus talked about laying up treasure on earth, as people do, where moth and rust corrupt and thieves break in and steal. If your hope is in your wealth, in your possessions, it's not going to be a very fulfilling or effective thing. And so here in Jeremiah, or in Lamentations, the writer recognizes that in all this destruction, this looking from the rubble, that the solution is turning to God. And basically points out in these verses 4 things that are helpful or that are important about God that allow this to be possible. And first is the fact that God is the source of hope. And if you notice in the reading and in the statements that he makes, yet this I call to mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him. Now that for the writer of Lamentations, that God is greater and bigger than any of these issues or problems. He's more powerful than the Babylonians. And you think about that realization as he's looking at the devastation that the Babylonians have brought to Jerusalem. And as they have destroyed the walls. In the ancient world, people were quite proud and felt quite safe behind their walls. And yet, those walls have been breached and destroyed. They took great pride in the temple and recognizing it as where God had set his presence and where the priests led the worship of God. And it had been devastated. That they had hoped in the externals of their culture, and it was all gone. And yet, what should have happened is that they should have realized that the hope for Judah was not in the temple, despite what it represented, or in the walls of the city, or in the king, but the hope was, or should have been, in God. Secondly, the writer of Lamentations, Jeremiah, says it's God's love. That it seems quite difficult for God to have allowed this devastation and loss, but that's often what happens in the world, isn't it? And yet, God's love, his unfailing, unchanging love, is still there. That he's faithful. And that he is a God of salvation and restoration. That while things, that's why you put your hope in him, because he is loving, because he is faithful, and he is the source of salvation and restoration. So I think there's some things we kind of understand about hope that come out of this. And if I can just kind of put those together, that hope does not look just for a change in circumstance. When you're in a difficult time, as I was working on this, I thought if you're in winter in Winnipeg, we're hoping for something to change, right? But yet, what's going to be happening in 9 months? I hate to say this. But what's going to be happening in 9 or 10 months? We're going to be back starting into this again. And all the people in Winnipeg got up and moved, right? That if our hope is in the short term, is in the idea of the immediate change, it's always going to be frustrated because change keeps happening. There's no point in hoping for what is short term or a change of circumstance. Hope, real hope does not trust in things that are temporary and passive. They fade. Like talking about the moth and the rust and the thieves. There is nothing in this world that is really secure. And it seems like the more people try to come up with ways to make things more secure, the more challenged others are to make them insecure. That we need to find something more permanent. Real hope looks to what is ultimate and final. That we may, think about it. There have been times in history where people have had to live their whole lives under oppressive political regime. Think back to the early Christians in the first and second, even into the 3rd century. Many of them lived their whole lives under the threat of death because of the empire. Many of them lived under a really dark cloud. And yet, they had a faith, they had a hope that transcended. And that's really the idea, that hope is going to transcend the circumstance. Which means that the hope is looking long term. Paul writes, who hopes for what he sees? That there is a quality to hope that goes above, beyond, longer than we can even begin to conceive. And so for Jeremiah, as he is looking at the devastation and the ruin, and as he is feeling, and I don't know if you noticed the beginning words of this. We could have read all the way up to this, but don't have time. But look at the statements like, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. I'm miserable. But when I'm just looking at my circumstances and feeling my pain, he says, but then what I remember is God. And so he recognizes that change can only come from God. The healing, the restoration, that's what the hope is. And so that's where he wants to turn. And that's where he wants to look. So let's go back, read through this, and think about, as Jeremiah is saying, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. And you think about it, it's bad, it's hard, it's crushing in many ways, but we're not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. And one of those things that I find really interesting in some parts of Scripture, that as the writer is speaking, and as they are putting things, into kind of their point of view, and as they're talking about God in a third person kind of a way, that he interjects a first person statement directly to God. Great is your faithfulness. Not just talk about God, but address and realize that he's the source. He is the one that I want to talk to. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him. That's the long term. I'm going to stick with him. You know, one of the greatest challenges for us as human beings is to line up our patience with God. We want, we laugh about the guy who prays, Lord, I want patience and I want it right now. That for Jeremiah, he's realizing that God's in control and God will bring things to happen. Think about it. If this was written at the very beginning of the Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah would know that it's going to be 70 years before the captivity will end. If somebody told you that at some major event in your life, kind of laugh thinking about, imagine a young couple planning to get married and they say, okay, we'll do it in 70 years. I mean, that's an eternity to us from a human perspective. And yet Jeremiah can say, the Lord is my portion. I will wait for him. He's the source of my hope and my trust. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. He's the answer. He's the one that I'm waiting for and I'm hoping for. He is the one that I'm trusting. We're going to close with a song, and you probably can guess which song it's going to be. It is a song that is based upon the words of this passage. And as we sing it, think of it not just as something to be sung or said, but think of it as the words that express your own faith, your own trust, your real hope in a living God. Let's stand as we sing.